My name's Howie Hawkins. I'm the Green Party candidate for U.S. Senate. And I'm running on three key issues. The first is to stop the war and bring our troops home. And the resources that we're wasting in Iraq, making life miserable not only for our troops but for all the people in Iraq, we ought to be spending here in the United States dealing with our own problems. One of those problems is we have 3 million uninsured in New York. We need a national health insurance program so everybody has coverage. Everybody has freedom of choice of who their providers are when they go for health care, which you don't have with private health insurance. We have the most inefficient and irrational system of financing health care in the world. We spend over twice as much per capita as any other country in the world, yet we have 46 million uninsured, 50 million underinsured, and even when you got a good insurance program, sometimes you have to fight your insurance company to get your coverages that you paid for. It shouldn't be that way. If we provided everyone with a Medicare type program, Medicare for all, we could provide full choice of who your providers are, every service from dental and optical to the basic medical coverages, and still save the economy $286 billion a year according to the Physicians for a National Health Program. And that's because the private health insurance spends over 30% of the health care dollar you spend on overhead for paperwork and bureaucracy, figuring out what coverages and who's going to get reimbursed. Every doctor has to hire 2.5 staff people just to do the paperwork with the insurance companies. And then they got to pay their executives high salaries, excessively high salaries, and then they pay profits to shareholders. By contrast, Medicare runs on 3% overhead. That's 30% versus 3%. So a single-payer national health insurance program is about 10 times more efficient. Every other industrial country has figured that out. We should too. So that's the second issue. Stop the war is the first one. National health insurance. And then we have an energy crisis we've got to deal with. We have a problem of global warming, peaking of oil production, whether that's now or, as the most optimistic say, within 35 years, it's the day of reckoning is coming. And because of it, oil prices are going to go up, energy costs are going to go up, and as the Fed chairman said recently, we're headed back to the 70s where we're going to have a stagnant economy plus inflation, stagflation, the worst of both worlds. But there are solutions to that. I'm saying let's take half the money we spend on military spending around the world every year and put it into renewable energy to rewire the planet with renewable energy over the next 10 years, a global public works program. The idea is to create a whole new energy infrastructure and make friends around the world instead of enemies, to spread goodwill instead of resentment with a global military occupation fighting for resource wars. And right now, U.S. policy is to fight for those resources until there are no more resources. And that doesn't make sense. So with a global public works program funded by $300 billion a year, we'd create a global engine of job creation and sustainable economic development. We would address the problem of global warming because we would reduce greenhouse gases. We would stabilize energy costs because renewables, we know, for example, wind comes in at 4.5 cents a kilowatt hour, and we wouldn't have this escalation we're now having with rising oil prices. We would deal with the problem of the U.S. trade deficit, 1/3 of which comes from importing oil. And here in New York, we would deal with a problem. We don't have jobs here because energy costs are high. That's the biggest reason. We have the highest energy costs in the continental United States. That's why manufacturing is leaving. That's the biggest reason. Plus, we would create hundreds of thousands of jobs retrofitting our buildings, our industries, our infrastructure with the efficient use of renewable energy. When I'm talking about solar, wind, geothermal heating and cooling, biofuels, there are all kinds of things we can do. Efficiency, that's another part of it. Efficient appliances, insulation on buildings. Just building this new infrastructure will keep, the world's working people busy for the next 10 years, and we can finance that with money we're now spending fighting for resources with our military budget. So those are the three issues. Out of Iraq, health care for all, and a renewable energy policy that's serious to address global warming and the need for a new energy source.
Why do you think Hillary Clinton has such a divide between what the voters in New York want and what Hillary Clinton's doing in terms of policy?
Well, if the majority of New Yorkers vote for what they want on the war, on energy, and on health care, I should be the next senator from New York because the polls show people stand where I'm standing, not with Clinton. They want out of Iraq. They do want a single-payer health care plan. We even had the state assembly pass one for the state back in the early 90s. It just didn't pass the state senate and get signed by the governor. And people want renewable, they want a serious program for renewable energy. So I think, the question as to why New Yorkers aren't ready to vote there, well, there was a poll that John Zogby did at the end of May, and it showed that if an anti-war candidate runs against Clinton, the question was, who would you vote for? Anti-war candidate, Clinton, or someone else? And 32% said they would vote for an anti-war candidate. Only 38% for Clinton, 21% were not sure, and 10% were for someone else, which presumably is the Republican. Which means that anti-war candidacy is within striking distance of Clinton. And so the problem for me as the anti-war candidate is to let people know that they have that option in November. But I think New Yorkers are ready to make that move. We see it happening now in Connecticut, where Joe Lieberman is he's running for his life because there's an anti-war challenger to him in the Democratic primary, Ned Lamont, who may win. We could see the same thing happen here in the general election in New York.
And, talk about fair taxes.
Well, over the last 30 years, the tax burden has shifted from the corporations and the wealthy people to the working class. We saw that with the Social Security tax reforms in the 80s, cutting revenue sharing, and that makes local governments have to raise property and sales tax, which place a higher burden on working people. We've seen that in the cuts of the top income tax rates at both the state and national level. We've seen it in the reduction of capital gains, and everywhere, and then there are corporate loopholes, and then there's corporate subsidies, welfare. So my basic principle is we should have the super rich and the giant corporations pay their fair share. If they paid the rates they were paying under the Republican administration of Eisenhower, we wouldn't have deficits now. We would have money for our social programs. It wouldn't be such a bad situation. So I'm not talking about soak the rich. I'm just saying make them pay their fair share. You don't want to soak the rich because then they won't invest and you have economic problems. But if they pay their fair share, then we'll have the resources we need for public goods and services.
The death penalty.
There's no reason to do a second wrong to right supposedly a first wrong. I'm opposed to the death penalty. The United States is one of only 2 countries in the world that executes children under 18, and we consider ourselves civilized. And then you make mistakes. We found that in Illinois, where the governor, a Republican governor, finally had to call a moratorium on the death penalty because they kept finding that so many of these people on death row